Hi there. My name is Robyn Ochs. I go by she and they pronouns, and I have identified as bisexual for 43 years. Yes, you heard that right, 43 years. Why is this important? It's important because there are still a lot of people out there who believe that bisexuality is just a phase. So I like to introduce myself as Exhibit A to demonstrate that for many of us, bisexuality is an enduring identity. For me, it's lasted my entire adult life. I also identify as queer and as pansexual. So thanks for showing up to today's program. I'm hoping that by the end of this session, you'll have a clear understanding of bi and bi plus identities. If you identify as bi or bi plus, I hope you leave this session with some really good tools to help you navigate the world and to respond to some of the ignorance and biphobia out there. If you identify by some other identity, I'm really glad you're here because you can gain tools to help you stand up for your friends who do identify as bi or bi plus. So I want to start off by defining a couple of terms. First one, bisexuality. What is that? I call myself bisexual because I acknowledge in myself the potential to be attracted romantically and or sexually to people of more than one gender, not necessarily at the same time, not necessarily in the same way, and not necessarily to the same degree. So for me, bisexuality is really an identity of potential. It's just a way of describing how I experience myself in the world. Bi plus. Bi plus is an umbrella term that is intended to hold the various and numerous identities held by people with non-binary sexualities, held by people who are attracted to people of more than one gender. And there are so many words out there. Bisexual is one, pansexual, queer, omni, fluid, multisexual, polysexual, straight-ish, gay-ish, heteroflexible, homoflexible. Some people say they're just sexual. There are so many different words out there. There are so many different words out there. And every one of these labels is the best label for some people. And different labels are the best label for other people. We don't have to come to agreement on one single label and all use the same word. I really like to think of identities as adjectives, as tools for communication. And as such, there isn't just one word that could potentially fit. There are many. And some of us even use different words in different conversations with different people. And because identities are adjectives, really you can have as many as you like, as many as you need to describe who you are. There's no limit. So my suggestion for all of us is that rather than arguing over which is the one word that everybody should use, that instead we take that energy and we work together to hold space, to make it safe and comfortable for all people with non-binary sexualities to exist in the world. If we can hold that space, this world would be a really, really beautiful place. And I want to say to you that no matter which identity you use, if any of these, I think you're beautiful. No matter which word you use, I think you're beautiful and I think you're amazing. This is my story. I grew up during a time when there was practically no public conversation about LGBTQ plus people. I can't think of a single LGBTQ plus character on television. And when I grew up, the internet didn't even exist. So I grew up mostly around silence with very little information. And honestly, it never even crossed my mind that I might be anything other than straight. So fast forward to college. My first month of college, I fall head over heels in love with another woman. It was exciting. It was exciting because having a crush is really an exciting feeling, but it was also terrifying. I didn't have a lot of information. I didn't know what this new information, if I listened to my heart, I didn't know what this would mean for my life. I knew I was bi, but I didn't know any bi people. And I didn't know how to be a bisexual person in the world. I got trapped between that space of knowing and being. I knew who I was, but I didn't know how to be that in the world. So I remained silent. I was silent for 5 years. And I assure you, that is not a healthy space to be. For 5 years, I was suffocating in my own silence. 5 years later, I had already graduated college and I was working at a group home. A coworker sat me down one evening and she said, "Hey, Robyn, there's something I want to tell you." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "I'm bisexual." And I looked at her and I blurted out, "So am I! So am I." And that was the first time I had ever said out loud to another person that I was bisexual. I experienced such a profound sense of relief. I don't think I realized until that moment just how much that silence was holding me down. So I started coming out to other people, and to my surprise, almost every single person I came out to responded better than I feared they would. I did get some strange responses, and there were definitely some people who needed time and information to process my bisexual identity. But eventually, over time, all of the people most important to me did come around. So, what was it that kept me stuck for 5 years? 2 things. First, what I didn't hear. The silence was deafening. And second, what I did hear. After I realized I was bisexual, I started to listen to what people were saying, and I realized that there were a lot of stereotypes out there. There were a lot of stereotypes out there, and I didn't feel strong enough to hold them. I knew that if I came out as bi, people would think all these things about me, and I just didn't even know how to deal with that. I didn't know how to respond, and that's why I kept quiet. In my real life speaking engagements, I usually ask people in the audience to help me generate a list of things that they've heard said about bisexuality or about bi plus people. And one thing I can say for sure is that people have no trouble at all generating a pretty long list of stereotypes. Here's one list that I'll share with you. What some people believe about bisexuality. Bisexuality is just a phase on the way to being gay or lesbian, that bisexuals are promiscuous, that we're confused, that bisexuality doesn't exist, that bisexual people are greedy, that women just say they're bisexual because it's trendy, that men just say they're bisexual because they don't want to admit that they're really gay, and so on and so forth. Another one that just comes to mind right now is pick a side. These stereotypes are what kept me scared and silent for so long. I was afraid that if I came out as bi, that people would think all these things about me. And at the time, I really wasn't strong enough to hold that. But here's what happened to me. I moved to Boston, and when I moved to Boston, I found a support group. I ended up in this support group called the Bivocals. And as an aside, one of the best things about identifying as bi is its pun potential. It's a wonderful prefix, and you can say all kinds of funny and clever things with that prefix. So anyway, I moved to Boston, and I found the Bivocals. And for me, the Bivocals was my first biphobia shield. It was my first protection from the biphobia and the bi-erasure that's out there. And it's really important to have other people around you who get you, who understand you, who can validate your experience and your reality and your identity. When somebody hurls a stereotype at you, it's really helpful to have someone else who you can look at and say, that was nonsense, wasn't it? And then your friend can look back at you and say, yeah, that was nonsense. So for those of you who are trying to figure out your identities, the most important thing you can do is find community, even if that community is just one friend with whom you can be real. For those of you who do identify as bi+, this is your first biphobia shield. Over time, I came to understand that the stereotypes about bisexuality aren't actually caused by bisexual people. They're caused by limitations in the ways that other people think. Let me explain what I mean by that. I'm going to share with you 5 frames. And between these 5 frames, I believe that we can explain why these stereotypes exist. First thing is that we are part of a culture that tends to think in very, very, very oversimplistic and binary ways. When we think about sexual orientation culturally, the tendency is to think about just 2 possibilities, gay and straight, and to think of those things as opposites. But we actually do this not just with sexual orientation, but we do this with lots of things. Think, for example, of how race is constructed in the United States. When most people think about race, they think black, white. And I have to say, that's a really, really oversimplistic binary. It leaves out entire categories of people, and it also leaves out people who identify as bi or multiracial. Another binary frame is our political frame: left, right, conservative, Republican, liberal, Democrat. Politics are so much more complicated than that. And of course, there's the gender binary: man, women. And I believe we're starting as a culture to get better about that and to understand that gender is a very complicated thing and that there are way more than two possibilities. But our tendency is to dumb things down, oversimplify them, and to think in binaries. And so for me, understanding that the erasure of bisexuality is not really about me personally. It's not even about all bisexual people. It's about binaries. And when I understand it that way, I find it a lot less hurtful. And some of the stereotypes that can be explained by that are, of course, that all bisexual people are just confused, that all bisexual women are just straight women who are trying to be trendy or to seek attention, that all bisexual men are really gay, that bisexuality is just a phase. So that's thing number 1. And my hand sign for that is the following. This is beautiful, rich, nuanced thinking. And this is binaries, pulling us out of a space of complexity and beauty and into a space of oversimplicity. So that's thing number 1. Thing number 2 is that bisexual people or bi+ people are really, really hard to identify. Short of wearing a t-shirt or a pin or a sign, we usually aren't seen. If I were walking down the street by myself, most people looking at me would just assume that I were heterosexual, and that's because of heteronormativity. We live in a culture where the default assumption is that everyone's straight, until we know specifically that they're not. If you saw me walking down the street with a man on my arm, you would probably jump to the conclusion that you were seeing a straight couple. And within that straight couple, you would probably jump even further to assume that you were seeing a straight man and a straight woman. So a mixed gender couple gets turned into one straight man and one straight woman. If you saw me walking down the street with a woman on my arm, you would probably think you were seeing two lesbians. So when does bisexuality become visible then? I guess I'd have to walk down the street with a man and a woman, one on each side of me, and I'd probably have to act in some way that was sort of sexualized for you to realize that we weren't just friends. And so I think when most people think about bisexuality, they think about the only context in which they actually notice it, which is in the context of people who are in multiple relationships, or people who are in threesomes, or people who are polyamorous. And so I think that's why people think that bisexuality equals polyamory. It's because a bisexual person who's in a monogamous relationship is assumed by the viewer to be either gay or straight, depending on the gender of the person's partner. And so my hand sign for that, I think about the expression, the tip of the iceberg, which is the idea that there's a lot of something, but we only see the little bit of it that's above the surface. And so my hand sign is this. So if this is all bisexual people, and these are the only people who people actually realize are bisexual, that's what's going on there. So that's thing number 2. Thing number 3 is our cultural ambivalence about sex and sexuality. In the United States, I believe we have a perverse relationship to the erotic. We are, on one hand, all about sex and sexuality. In our culture, we over-sexualize everything. We are taught that our value lies in how sexy we are. We're taught to spend billions of dollars on products to make us look sexier. We treat people better if they're perceived as sexy. So our culture is very fixated and obsessed with sex and sexuality. But on the other hand, we're really uncomfortable with this topic. And so we're both told to be it and not be it, to do it and not do it. And we're expected to walk this tightrope between two contradictory ideas. And I don't know, my experience is that it's not really possible to walk that tightrope because it's way too narrow a path. And so, but I think that our cultural discomfort with sexuality plays out in very dangerous ways on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people. It's very, very dangerous for us because, in part, when people think about us, they sexualize us. And because they're uncomfortable with sexuality in general, that makes them uncomfortable with us. And I think especially for bisexuality, which is, in many people's imaginations, all about sex, it makes them just squirm when they see us. So that's thing number 3. And when I think about a way to represent that, I think about the mixed messages that we get, like be sexual, don't be sexual. And I think that creates a kind of weird dissonance for all of us. And so I like to make that the sign for our cultural ambivalence about sexuality, just this, because it distorts our vision. It distorts other people's vision, and it distorts our vision as well. Thing number 4 is the fact that very few people get a good formal education about LGBTQ plus people. In real life speaking engagements, I ask people, raise your hand if you got a really great education about LGBTQ plus people through your high school curriculum. And everybody usually just goes, ha ha. not me. And occasionally someone will raise their hand, but usually that's someone who's either been homeschooled or who went to some progressive alternative school. But most people in the United States have had very little education on LGBTQ plus people, and they tend to rely just on the stuff that they hear, you know, in random places, and sometimes what they hear is just really, really misinformed. And the reason I think this is important is when people say things to me that are ignorant or hurtful, I just try to remember that they're not necessarily saying those things to hurt me. They may be saying those things because they haven't had the opportunity to get a good education on this topic, and that it's really about them, not about me. That doesn't mean that there aren't some people who aren't willfully ignorant who are trying to be hurtful, but I really believe that the vast majority of people who say things that offend me don't even realize that they're doing that. And so that just makes me a lot less angry and a lot less hurt. My hand sign for that is a 0 in front of my brain, for ignorance, for lack of information. Thing number 5. I think many of us have heard some pretty hurtful things said about bi plus people from lesbians and gay men, from other people in our own community. There's an expression, hurt people, which is the idea that when you are a member of an oppressed community, a community that experiences oppression, it's really hard. It is really, really hard to navigate. It's really hard to exist because you're always experiencing the discomfort of that oppression, and that some people, one of the dynamics that happens is that sometimes people who are experiencing oppression take their pain out horizontally on other people in their own community instead of focusing their anger toward the oppressor. And part of that's because it's a lot easier to find people in your own community than it is to figure out where the oppressor is. Like, where is the heteropatriarchy? Where is the cis heteropatriarchy? I don't know where it is. It's everywhere. And so it's hard to kind of punch back at it. And so sometimes instead of doing that, we just act mean toward people in our own community. We repeat the hurt that's been done to us, and we do it to other people. And so when people in my community say things to me that are hurtful, I try my very best to remember that that's just pain speaking. It doesn't mean it's okay. It's absolutely not okay, but it helps me understand where it's coming from. And therefore, it helps me understand that it's not really about me. It's about them. It's about their pain. So my hand sign for that one is the following. This is me punching myself. Hurt people, hurt people. And again, all the stereotypes I showed you before can be explained by the dynamics I just told you. So the 5 of them were binary thinking. Oops, wrong. Let me start that over. Binary thinking, the tip of the iceberg, our ambivalence about sexuality, our lack of education and information, and hurt people, hurt people. So now what happens for me is that when somebody says something mean or dismissive about bi or bi plus people, I just think, which of these things are they doing? Like, where is that coming from? So if someone says, oh, all bisexual people are just confused, I think to myself, binary thinking. I think to myself, lack of information. And if that person is someone in my own community, I think, hurt people, hurt people. If I hear someone say, oh, bisexual people are slutty, I think, ooh, that's our discomfort with that whole topic, huh? And basically, instead of thinking, I'm not like that, I think, what is that person doing? What are you doing? And it really puts it on them and not on me. And for me, this is my second biphobia shield. This is something that makes me so much more powerful, because now this doesn't mean that the stereotypes still don't come into my ears, but I don't hear people say stuff. But it means that I no longer believe that it's about me. I really understand that it's about them. So 2 biphobia shields. One is having community, and the second one is understanding that the stereotypes out there are really, really not about you. Because it's really easy to feel like you're very unusual or like you're the only one, here's a 1-minute summary of what the current research is showing. 1, more and more people, an increasing number of people, are identifying as LGBTQ+. 2, younger folks are much more likely to identify as LGBTQ+ than their elders. What's been happening is that every generation is getting increasingly queer. So boomers would be the least, and Gen Z the most. And 3, there's a rise in non-binary sexualities and non-binary gender identities. So non-binary identities of multiple kinds are becoming more and more common. So I have to say, this research makes me very happy. So a few more things I want you to know before I send you off on your way. 1, remember that labels are complicated. If you asked 100 people who identify as bisexual exactly what that term means, you will get multiple different definitions. This is true also for people who identify as pansexual, people who identify as queer, people who identify as lesbian or gay or straight. Labels have multiple meanings. So if somebody shares with you their label, if somebody comes out to you and tells you how they identify, remember that you don't know exactly what they mean by that label. I try to remember that labels are like a sign on the door, but to understand the full story of who someone is, you really need to knock politely on that door and go inside and get more information. So when someone comes out to me, I try to remember to do the following. The first thing I do is I thank them. It takes courage to come out. Coming out is an act of trust. So if someone comes out to me, I thank them for trusting me. I thank them for sharing that information. The second thing I try to remember to do is to ask them if they would be willing to tell me more about what that identity means to them. After, and only after we've had that second conversation, do I know what that person has just told me. Another thing to keep in mind is that identity is a journey. It is absolutely fine if you don't have everything all figured out. As you travel through life, you will learn more about yourself. And some things that are currently questions may become clear. I'll also add that some things that are currently clear may become questions. That's fine. It's called life. It's called life. It's a feature, not a flaw. So just do your best to enjoy your own personal journey. And here's my ask of you. Let's support each other. Let's work together to hold space for all of the different identities. However you identify, I think you are beautiful. I affirm you. I support you. I respect you. And remember, you are not alone. There are lots and lots of bi, pan, queer, and other bi plus people out there, and we come in every size, every age, every color, every race, and we are everywhere. So thank you so much for listening to this program, and I hope you have a happy Pride Month. Bye.